one.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar from the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities on the impact of COVID-19 on state and local budgets. Before we dive in here, I do want to wish everyone good health and safety, especially in the challenging most recent week here. And so I want everyone to know that we are hoping for your health and safety in these challenging times. And certainly we have an interesting discussion this morning on one aspect of that, and that being the impact of COVID-19 on state and local budgets. So diving forward here, a little bit of what we're going to do today. I'm going to give a brief legislative update and just remind everyone where things are at in terms of the legislature. We're going to do an overview of the most recent state budget forecast, an update on the CARES Act funding from the federal government that local governments are expecting to be distributed. And then finally, we're going to look at what are the options that the state has for balancing the budget and what impact that might have on cities and local government aid. So going forward, the legislature. So the legislature finished its regular session. Without passing a bonding bill, without passing a tax bill, without addressing the CARES Act distribution for local governments. There is a significant expectation that there will be a June 12th special session. And that special session would be necessary if the governor decides that he wants to renew his emergency powers for another month. At that point, if the governor decides to do that, a special session is automatically called. So there was a lot that was unfinished during the regular session, but there is also, I think, the strong expectation that there will be certainly at least a special session here in the middle of June. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, special sessions probably later into the summer and the fall. So diving into the real substance of our discussion this morning, the state budget and the impact. We want to review a little bit, first off, where we're at in the cycle. So we are in the middle of our current fiscal biennium, our 2-year cycle. It started July 1st, 2019 with the state budget that was done during the 2019 regular and special legislative session that ended in May of 2019. And our current cycle ends June 30th, 2021. And this timing will become important as we discuss some of the options that the legislature has going forward. And so we are pretty well smack in the middle of that cycle right now. On February 27th, 2020, that's when the regular February forecast was done, we had a surplus of $1.5 billion. At that time, the MMB, the Minnesota Management and Budget, discussed several risk factors, including consumer confidence, financial market volatility, trade policy uncertainty, all the usual things that they include in a budget forecast in terms of what the risk factors going forward are. Number 4, interestingly, was prolonged and widespread virus outbreak. And it did appear as number 4 in their documents, which even at that time we had some sense of coronavirus obviously coming, had been an object of discussion around the world since December. At that point, we had 16 months remaining in the fiscal biennium. Fast forward to March 11th, 2020. Here are some pictures of our CGMC Legislative Action Day, where we had all of our members come in and lobby the legislature. And it really is, as we sort of talked about it around the office here, it was sort of the last normal day. At the beginning of the day, right, we talked a little bit about social distancing. We were encouraging elbow bumps versus handshakes. We had the governor come and speak to us, all proceeding along as though things for the next months after that were going to be normal. By the end of the evening, though, the NBA had canceled their whole season, and it was very clear that events were running very quickly towards a much different look for the coming months. And indeed, that is what we saw. It was very next week that the legislature essentially shut down for several weeks while they figured out how to legislate in the era of a pandemic. It was the next week that the governor issued his emergency orders in which schools were closed and bars and restaurants and the like were closed, and we're moving towards even greater closing of the economy. And so between that time, right there beginning at March 11th, 12th, into the coming weeks, I think our understanding of what the pandemic would mean for Minnesota really evolved pretty quickly. And one of the considerations and one of the things that I think folks started looking at really pretty quickly was what was going to be the impact of the pandemic and the shuttering of the economy on state and local budgets. And so this is a graph that compares the 2001 recession to the Great Recession to projections related to COVID-19 in terms of the impact on state budgets from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And what we see just comparing to the Great Recession to COVID-19 is a much steeper and quicker projected impact. Whereas in 2010, the shortfall for state governments was $230 billion. This group is estimating that in 2021, we're looking at $370 billion. And so much, much different and much greater than anything that we have experienced, certainly in our lifetimes. So to get a handle on where things were headed, another state budget projection was done, and that was issued on May 5th. And this is really historic and unprecedented. Certainly in my time doing this over the last 15 years, the state has not taken this step of issuing a whole full-blown budget projection. One of the reasons that it was necessary was to trigger access to the budget reserves if they needed. And in doing the work, what MMB and their economic consultants found or determined was that they were projecting a deficit of $2.42 billion for the current budget cycles. And for those of you doing the math, that's a $4 billion swing from the February forecast that had only been done just 2-3 months prior. One thing to note as we go forward, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, is that our budget reserve is currently at its highest level in state history at $2.36 billion. So here we see sort of the March of our fiscal situation. November forecast, we had a $1.3 billion surplus. The picture got even a little bit better in February with a $1.5 billion surplus. And then in May, obviously, we, with a revised projection, hit $2.4 billion. And there's a question mark over August there. I think everyone is anticipating that there will be some additional budget projections done late summer, early fall, so that at that point the legislature and the administration have a clearer sense of really what the impact of COVID-19 and the slowing and shuttering of parts of the economy have had. Part of the forecast that was done relied on this national look at gross domestic product. Pretty simple graph, but I think pretty striking nonetheless. The dotted line starting there in February shows what the projection was at that time when the February forecast was done in terms of national GDP. And then the solid line, of course, is the projection, starting in April with the new projection. And what you see obviously is a pretty significant decrease in the first and second quarters, a bottoming out into the third quarter, and then in the fourth quarter, a resumption of more positive numbers. And then that continues through 2021. So that's what they looked at in terms of projecting state revenue in terms of individual income taxes and the state general sales tax. And these are our two biggest sources of general fund revenue. And when you look at individual income tax receipts, those are projected to be down $1.6 billion, 6.4%. Again, a lot of this is hard at this point to project, especially since income tax filings and payments have been pushed back until July. And that's another reason why I suspect that there will be another budget projection done in August, because then we will have the benefit of those numbers coming in and a little bit more clarity on what income tax collections were. Likewise, with sales taxes projected to be $1.3 billion, or 11.2% less than the February forecast. And again, there's delays in recognizing to the state when these come through, when businesses have to make their remittances, et cetera. And so it'll become clearer the later into the year that we get just what we are dealing with in terms of those revenue sources. The risk factors that the forecast presented: consumer and business confidence. Obviously, do folks feel confident, and when will they feel confident to reopen and to resume commercial activity? Business survival. There is the unfortunate question of, for those businesses that closed during the shutdown order, how many of them will actually come back? Financial market volatility, fiscal monetary policy, and federal support. And I think these are big questions that we're going to be talking about here in the next couple of minutes as well, in terms of, in many ways, there is very little the state can do to cushion the impact of some of this. And as we saw with the Great Recession, the federal government rather, did step in with quite a bit of support to states and local governments. And there's been some of that already so far. And then revenue delays. Just as in your own budgets, you're looking at what are the delays in terms of property tax remittances. When will the money come in for the state government? And so lots of uncertainty as we go forward here, and a lot of unknowns. And I think that we will see with each passing month a sharpening of what the picture actually looks like. So this is just another look at kind of the budget situation. The piece that I want to key in on, though, is on the expenditures side. When you do a budget forecast, obviously not only are you counting the money that is coming in terms of revenue, but you're also looking at what are your expenditures. And we know a couple of things: that first, in times of stress and crisis, demand on state resources and government resources increases as folks need additional help. And then also, too, that the legislature has already spent several $100 million addressing the COVID crisis already. And so as they factor in expenditures, they're looking at an additional $300 to $400 million of expense here over the next year or so factored into this. So one of the things that we talked about a little bit is federal support and what that could mean for state and local government. And so the next couple of minutes, we'll spend some time here talking about the CARES Act money and what that will mean for the state and for cities specifically. On March 27th, President Trump signed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. This, of course, is the legislation that funded the direct assistance to many Americans in the form of $1,200 checks. This is the legislation that provided for the Paycheck Protection loans to small businesses, as well as funding to other entities such as hospitals, public health, schools, and the like. For our purposes, we'll be really zeroing in on the money that went specifically to the state and local governments. So the way that it was structured for state and local governments is the federal legislation sends money to each state on a per capita basis, with some minimums there to make sure that the small states get some amount of money, as well as to local governments with populations over 500,000. And so for the state of Minnesota, that meant that Hennepin and Ramsey counties were the only Minnesota local units of government that received a direct allocation through the CARES Act. And their total, if you put the two together, was $317 million. And so the balance, $1.8 billion, is what the state received to deal with the COVID-19 public health crisis and to potentially distribute to local governments. So one of the questions is, does the state actually have to share their money with local governments that did not receive a direct payment from the federal government? And so in the federal Q&A, on the legislation, the question is asked, should states receiving a payment transfer funds to local governments that did not receive payments directly from Treasury? And so the answer is yes, they should. And the reasoning for doing it this way is that the federal government decided that it would be more administratively feasible to rely on the states to distribute dollars to those local governments under 500,000 in population. And the recommendation and what the guidance suggests is appropriate is that 45% of the state's allocation is what should be transferred to local governments. Now, this does not mean that the states have to share their money. It does not mean that the states have to send out 45% of their allocation to local governments. But the federal guidance and the federal law strongly suggests that that was their intent. And certainly that has been the intent, I think, of the Walz administration and certainly the legislature as they've discussed the disposition of these monies. So what is the status and what are the questions that need to be answered? First off, there's the basic question of who decides. Who decides when the money goes out, how much the money goes out, under what circumstances does it go out, how much money will my city get? Still a big question. And then when will we get it? And so we'll take a couple of minutes to attempt to answer some of these questions here. So the first basic question of who decides, well, you really have two options, right? You've got the legislature passing a bill, or there is the option that the Walz administration could do it through something called the Legislative Advisory Commission. So during the regular legislative session, both the House and the Senate introduced legislation to distribute the dollars to local governments around the state, cities, counties, and townships. The Senate actually passed their bill off of the floor. Senator Rosen was the chief author of the bill in the Senate, and she's been very actively engaged in these discussions all the way through. The House had a couple of hearings on their bill, sponsored by Representative Marquardt, who is the tax chair, but never actually passed it off of the House floor. And so there was never a conference committee, there was never any sort of legislative resolution during the legislative session. They still could do this during a special session. The other option is that for monies that the state receives from the federal government or that are sometimes grants from other entities, there is a process known as the Legislative Advisory Commission that is used when the legislature is not in session. And so the Walz administration, through Commissioner Franz of MMB, could simply determine how they're going to do it, send their plan to the Legislative Advisory Commission, which is made up of the legislative caucus leaders and then relevant committee chairs. And at that point, the LAC would get to review the proposal. They could sort of put a 10-day hold on it before any final decision was made to sort of review things and have further discussions with the administration. But in the end, the legislature's role in that process really is advisory. And so in that way, the Walz administration could just determine what their plan is, run it through the Legislative Advisory Commission process, and then end up distributing the money. There is some discussion now, and there's lots of back and forth behind the scenes in terms of how this should happen. The legislature is talking to local units of government. CGMC has been very involved in these discussions, and they are also talking to the legislature. And so it could be that if there is a June 12th legislative session, that the legislature passes a bill at that time. But it also could be that it's decided that it's more expedient for the Walz administration to simply send the money out through the LAC process. And that is yet to be determined. Those are discussions that are very, very much ongoing as we speak. So secondly, how much money are we even really talking about? Well, there's not necessarily even agreement on that. As MMB and the legislature did their initial calculations of what that 45% would be, looking at the $1.8 billion total, that number comes down to $667 million. And so that was the amount of money that was initially talked about being available to cities, counties, and townships. And that's the amount of money that's distributed through the Senate's plan. They take all $667 million and run it through a formula and distribute it out. The House, on the other hand, their bill only distributes $567 million through a formula that's, again, sort of done on a per capita basis. They decided that they thought it prudent to hold back $100 million for future unknown circumstances, so that money would not yet be distributed and would be withheld until some future time if other needs arose. Now, what is this $871 million on the far right of your screen here? That is based on guidance and responses from the federal government to questions that came out over the weekend. They calculated the 45% differently than I think the state and many states had been looking at it. They said that Minnesota's entire allocation was not only the $1.8 billion that went to the state, but also includes the $317 million that went to Hennepin and Ramsey. And so that increases the amount of money that you're looking at, and so your 45% ends up being an even bigger number. And so there is ongoing questions to the administration in terms of what their interpretation of the law is, and if they think that $171 million might end up being available. I think realistically, based on the conversations that we've been having, it really is looking at probably something in the 567 to 667 range is probably the total that will get distributed. How that will get distributed and what each city will get on an individual basis is, again, still being determined. That would, the factors that go into play there are how much do you set aside for the townships? What's the per capita split between cities and counties? Are you just dividing up the money equally, or are you dividing up the money between all local governments on a per capita basis? All of those questions play into how much money any individual or particular city may get. So when will the money come? That is the other million-dollar question. And the answer, again, is we do not know, because a lot of it depends on how these other decisions are made. And so I think there is universal agreement that we would like the money to go out. Everyone would like the money to go out as soon as possible, because, of course, cities and counties have already incurred quite a bit of expenses, and they're also planning various response items. And so there is significant question about when the money will come. The only thing that everyone says is as soon as possible. There was a hearing yesterday in the Senate Finance Committee where Commissioner Franz was sort of asked fairly directly, when can local governments expect their money? And his answer has been the same as the administration's answer for the last 3 weeks is, well, we'd like to get it out there as soon as possible. We realize the local units of government are needing this money, and we're working on getting it out the door. So unfortunately, when it comes to the timing and amounts of the CARES Act money for local governments, there are a lot of questions. One of the things that there is also a lot of questions on are, okay, when the money comes, what are the restrictions and requirements around the money? What are its eligible uses? What's the time period that we have to spend these dollars? And so we're going to answer some of these questions next. So the way the law is structured is that the CARES Act money is for necessary expenditures due to the COVID-19 public health emergency. Pretty broad, pretty clear somewhat. Expenses, secondly, expenses that are not accounted for in the most recent state or local budget. So it can't be things that you already budgeted for. It has to really be above and beyond your normal operations and in response to the COVID-19 public health emergency. And the money has a time limitation on it in that it is only eligible for expenses incurred between March 1st and December 30th, 2020. And so there really is a narrow window in which to spend this money. So there's a fairly broad interpretation of eligible expenses, and we're going to sort of drill into these layer by layer here. And so broadly, it's for addressing medical or public health needs. That's pretty self-explanatory. And also for second order effects of the emergency, such as providing economic support to those suffering from employment or business interruptions due to COVID-19 related business closures. The one thing that has been very clear throughout both reading the initial legislation and then all the subsequent guidance and FAQs, is that it is not for revenue replacement. It is not intended to backfill lost tax collections, backfill lost property tax collections or sales tax collections that you're otherwise counting on to fund your normal operations. That is been very clear in all of the guidance that we've received so far, is that the money is not for revenue replacement. So what are the eligible uses? Diving in again at another more granular level. So broadly, medical expenses, those include expenses of public hospitals, clinics, and similar facilities, testing of folks in the community, and emergency medical transportation. Public health expenses, such as communication and enforcement of public health measures, medical and protective supplies such as sanitizing products and PPE, things that I know a lot of local governments have been spending money on, and expenses related to quarantining individuals. So if your city is spending money to quarantine individuals, that would be a eligible expense. Payroll expenses for COVID dedicated employees. Now this is, I think, where the guidance has shifted a little bit. And so it applies to public safety, public health, healthcare, human services, and similar employees. And what the initial guidance stated was that the services of those employees must be substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 emergency. However, the FAQ goes on to define what substantially dedicated means. And reading directly here from a frequently asked question document from the Treasury Department, it says the fund is designed to provide ready funding to address unforeseen financial needs and risks created by the COVID-19 public health emergency. For this reason, and as a matter of administrative convenience in light of the emergency nature of this program, a state, territorial, local, or tribal government may presume that payroll costs for public health and public safety employees are payments for services substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to COVID-19. And so that potentially is a pretty broad interpretation of the types of payroll expenses that CARES Act money could be used for. I would caution folks that the Treasury Department seems to be continually updating and revising their interpretation of some of these things, and that things do change. But it does open up, I think, a pretty broad spectrum of expense that could potentially be covered as eligible from the CARES Act money. Actions to facilitate compliance with public health measures. And so this is the money expended to allow for public employees to work from home and for public businesses to be done remotely. It could cover sick and paid family medical leave for public employees, and care for the homeless provided to mitigate COVID-19 and to encourage social distancing and to mitigate the spread of the virus in the homeless community. And so lots of, again, of potential expenses that would be covered under that category. Expenses associated with the provision of economic supports, grants to small businesses to reimburse for costs of business interruption, unemployment insurance costs, things like that. Fund accountability. Unspent funds need to be returned to the Department of Treasury. Again, at the end of the year, the federal government will be asking for any of their unspent money back. And also that records should be kept to demonstrate compliance with federal law. And so this extends not only to the state governments, but then also to the local units of government. In both pieces of legislation that the House and the Senate passed, there were accountability measures that if it was found that the federal government came knocking on the state's door to recoup costs that they felt were not eligible, that had been incurred by a local government, that the state itself could actually add to your property tax levy to recoup those costs. One of the things that I think is being contemplated by the Department of Revenue, which would be administering these funds on behalf of local governments, is that it would be a front-end distribution to cities and counties. You would be certifying at that point what you'd be certifying that you would be complying with the law, and from there you would be able to spend the money. I know one of the things that we have gotten a lot of questions from cities about, and that cities are concerned about, is this very issue of spending funds inappropriately and what happens then. And so I think that the best thing for all of us is to continue to track the federal guidance in terms of what comes out. And I would imagine that the Department of Revenue will also have some guidance for local governments once the money comes forward and they start distributing it. For the time being, you can find the Treasury guidance on the Treasury website. We did create a bit.ly link for you that is there, or you can easily find it also by simply Googling CARES Act Treasury guidance, and that will take you to a landing page from which you can find the guidance for state and local governments. It's been a good resource, but like I said, it does change frequently. The other thing I think that folks are looking at and wondering about is, will there be another round of funding for state and local governments from Congress? And there has been discussion of that. There is the HEROES Act that was introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives several weeks ago that had more money for state and local governments. I think one of the things that is under discussion is whether that money, if it came forward, would be allowed to be used for revenue replacement. I think there is significant recognition on the part of everyone that that is going to be one of the greatest challenges for local governments and state governments going forward. And so I think that will be part of the discussion. But of course, we are relying on the federal government to decide what to do and to move that along. And so unfortunately, for the time being, the most concrete thing we have is the dollars that we've already received through the CARES Act. So what then are the options for balancing the state budget? So in terms of actually doing it, there are three really choices. There could be a special session early this fall. The legislature and the governor could simply wait until the 2021 session, or there is certainly also the tool of an allotment that the administration has that is out there. And when asked about this early in the crisis, Myron Friends did say that in terms of dealing with the state budget, all tools are on the table, and that would certainly include an allotment. In terms of the legislature, the first two options, either a special session or dealing with the regular session, what would be the levers that they would have to pull? It would be a lot like normal circumstances where they're dealing with budget adjustments, is that they could pass a supplemental budget. And there are the options, and I would imagine it would be some combination of all of these. The first option is to simply adjust spending or adjust revenue. The state is always, or the legislature is always adjusting spending for programs in midstream through the tool of a supplemental budget. And so the legislature could come in to session and say, okay, we're going to cut spending in this area, this area, and this area. We might adjust revenue here, although I don't think that revenue adjustment would have much of an impact in the near term in terms of this $2.4 billion for the current fiscal cycle, as that takes time, obviously, to ramp up and be recognized. Another option would be the use of the budget reserve, which is, again, at a historic $2.359 billion level and is pretty close on a dollar level to match what we currently believe the deficit to be. And then finally, there's the accounting tools that the state has sometimes used to balance budgets, such as shifting the timing of school payments, from one fiscal year into the next. Of course, that money does have to be paid back and made whole at some point, but that is another tool that the legislature certainly has to make adjustments in the current state budget. So if you're looking at a late summer or early fall special session, what would that exactly mean? First, it would give the state some time to do another budget projection, potentially in August or September, once we have a clearer sense of what revenues are coming in. It would be before the election and with the current legislature. And, one may make the political calculation if you're the governor that you don't know what's going to happen in November. and that it is better to deal with the legislature and legislative leaders that you know versus an unknown set of characters and circumstances if majorities were to change in the legislature, a whole host of unknowns if you do it after. And so from my perspective, this seems to me to be the most likely outcome. This also gives you more time in the remainder of the fiscal year to make adjustments, and you will have more choices because less money will have gone out the door. It is entirely possible, though, that you could wait for the 2021 session. Now, I do not think that this will be the outcome for a number of reasons. First, as I stated, at that point you are in January and trying to balance a budget, a two-year budget, with basically the resources that remain for the remainder of the 5 or 6 months until the end of June. So you would have very few options in terms of the actual programming changes that you could make. You'd also be dealing with, as I said, a new legislature following the November 3rd election. There would be a lot of uncertainty, I think, in that. The other piece of this is that the new legislature that comes into session in 2021, under normal circumstances, their first task would be to do the budget for the next biennium that starts July 1st. And so I think it would be a very difficult task and a difficult to expect the legislature to not only fix the budget deficit for the current biennium, but then to also do a budget for the next biennium at the same time. I think it would be incredibly complex and daunting. Getting a budget done under the best of circumstances is difficult. I can't imagine what trying to fix a deficit and do another budget for the next biennium would really look like. And so I think that that option is probably the least likely. Next, unallotment, and I hesitate to even bring up the word given the history, especially as it relates to local government aid, but it is one of those things that is a tool that the governor rather has at his disposal, and in the words of Myron Franz, would be on the table. And so how would unallotment work? What are the circumstances that need to come into play for that to be used? First, Commissioner of MMB may use unallotment only after first, a balanced budget has been enacted into law, and this is based on a Supreme Court decision that actually came out in light of the Pawlenty unallotments of 2009. For those of you who recall, he simply vetoed a number of the budget balancing bills at the end of the legislative session and then proceeded with unallotment. And the Supreme Court determined that you cannot unallot if you do not have a fully balanced budget passed into law. Next, the Commissioner of MMB would need to determine that revenues will be less than originally anticipated. And that again would be another thing that a late summer, early fall budget projection could be used for to make that determination. Next, the governor would have to approve the unallotment. And then finally, the commissioner would need to, again, seek the advice and run it through the Legislative Advisory Commission process. Again, remember that that process is largely advisory, and so after the timelines run out, the unallotments could go forward. We've seen unallotment a number of times here in the last several years, obviously most recently with Governor Tim Pawlenty. And these numbers here represent the total amounts that were unallotted, not just as many of you are probably keying into, not just LGA, but that's the total unallotments that were done recently. So LGA and unallotment, what could the governor do? So the governor could reduce the total to the LGA program. So currently there's $560 million that's going to LGA. He could say, okay, we're only going to do, $450 million of that, and then rerun and recertify everyone's LGA and distribute it on that basis. The governor cannot target unallotment to specific cities. So the governor could not, for instance, pick and choose and say, well, we're going to unallot Minneapolis, but we're not going to unallot Bagley. And finally, the other wrinkle is that the governor could, and this is based on statute, apply allotment reductions based on all sources of revenue available. And so for those of you who recall when the legislature was reducing LGA in light of the Great Recession. They did so on a basis where they looked at what is a city's total levy plus their aid, and then reduced a percentage of that. And what that does is it mitigates the impact on those cities that are more LGA dependent, and so that it doesn't take 15% of an LGA cut to a city that is very reliant on LGA is much different than a similar percentage cut to a city who is much less reliant on LGA. And so that's the basis on which the legislature has done LGA cuts in the past. And that would be an option available to the administration if they went that route. So what does this mean for 2020 and 2021 LGA? So here is Governor Walz answering a question at a press conference that's actually based on a press release that the CGMC put out on May 5th when the budget projection came out. And so let's take a listen to what the governor had to say. He addresses LGA kind of at the beginning of his answer, then he wanders into some other discussion and then circles back to it. So sit tight and take a listen.
Scott Peterson, Minnesota News Network. The Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities came out with a reaction to the budget projection earlier today, saying city officials are anxious about their LGA payments. Are they going to get LGA, and what would you say to allay those fears?
Yeah, and I would say with everything on the table, I think that you do get an idea of where people's ideology is around budgeting and good fiscal management. I made it a very central piece to restore LGA back to where it was in 2002, 2003. I think it's smart usage of this. I want to speak to all of those mayors, city councils, school board members, county commissioners. We're in this together, and we're trying to figure out what happens with the federal money that comes to us. That really is the game changer too. And keeping in mind, Minnesota is a state that is nearly the last one that gets money from the federal government. We're 47th. We give, and our money goes elsewhere, which we are proud to help the country, whether it's for defense or other things like that. At a time like this, our hope is, and we'll keep asking, and on a call yesterday, Secretary Mnuchin seemed to indicate that there was more flexibility for us to be able to use this money. The one thing that I will tell you is that I am deeply concerned about local budgets. I view it as our responsibility to figure out how to be partners with them to get that out. And again, that's a conversation I had with the federal delegation this morning, and that is a real point of emphasis for the legislature to figure out how do we help these budgets.
So that was the answer at the time on May 5th in terms of the governor's thinking around local government aid. I don't know that we have any additional clarity in terms of what the governor or Commissioner Franz might be thinking specifically. But I do think that there's, a couple of points here in which there are questions and which the circumstances may provide some answers. And so as you're looking at your next two LGA payments and then what will happen to LGA in 2021, I have a few thoughts. But I would really, first off, characterize this as speculation based on our best understanding of what we know now, and that certainly lots can change, and as we've seen, it can change very quickly. I think as it relates to the 2020, the July 2020 LGA payments, we have not heard any talk that those payments would be in any way withheld, reduced, changed. There has been no discussion of that at any level. And so I am reasonably confident that the first half LGA payment will go out as scheduled. Now the December 2020 LGA payment, that could be potentially different, right? In that at that point we will theoretically have some sort of revised budget projection. We may or may not have had a legislative special session to address the budget at that time. And so that payment, again, might be more in question. And if you recall the unallotments in the Pawlenty administration, we had an unallotment of the December payment a week before it was supposed to go out. which obviously left city governments to scramble. However, as you look at the circumstances as they are now, and based on the numbers that we have now, if you are looking at a $2.3 billion budget reserve, that to me seems like should be the first line of defense before we are touching these other payments. And so I do believe that the governor and the administration, as the governor said, is pretty committed to local government aid and local governments. And so I think it would be certainly unlikely that anything would happen to the July payment, and less likely that anything would happen to the December payment, based on the fact that we do have a pretty robust budget reserve. In 2020, the payments that are supposed to go out there, I think there is more question, right, in terms of what will the legislature do as they look into the future and as they determine what is the long-term impact for the state. We were, of course, expecting an additional $4 million into the program to get up to the 2003 level that we've talked about so many times, that takes effect in 2021. And so that will be a matter of discussion. But again, the state currently has enough tools and options in terms of the budget reserve, in terms of accounting things, in terms of other things that they can do, that I would be surprised that based on the deficit as it's currently projected, that a lot would need to be done with LGA. But again, we will see. And again, that will be something that CGMC will be watching very carefully as we go forward. And so as we go forward, we're working on a number of things on a number of fronts as it relates to COVID-19. And obviously we're doing our regular work as it relates to a bonding bill and making sure that infrastructure is passed. But in the near term, we've been really focused on protecting your city resources. The minute that it became clear that there was going to be potentially a deficit, CGMC started talking about the LGA payments need to go out to cities in time and in full, because cities are very much on the front lines of responding to COVID-19, and the services that you provide are going to be the foundation of whatever recovery. And so LGA obviously plays a critical role in that, especially as local governments are looking at reductions in resources from other sources like property taxes, local option sales taxes, and the like. The CARES Act money, we've been actively engaged in the discussion about the CARES Act money. We've testified in committees. We've been doing a lot of coordinating actually with the other municipal lobbying groups, the League of Cities, the Metro Cities Organization, the Small Cities, and the Municipal Legislative Commission on a joint approach from municipalities in Minnesota to make sure that the needs of cities across the state are taken care of. We've been working very well together on that basis, and we've been very much a part of the discussion on the CARES Act money. And as we go into the next couple of days here, where I expect there to be some sort of resolution, we will be continuing to engage with the legislature and the administration. One of the other things that we've been doing is spending a lot of time through the labor and employment program of CGMC to do webinars and update emails and guidance and best practices and advice for cities and insight in terms of how to handle labor and employment situations that have arisen because of COVID. We've done a number of webinars. We have another one coming up here June 9th. And so stay tuned for more information about those. And then in the long term here, definitely looking at investing in the recovery and what are we going to need to do in order to make sure that once the immediate crisis has passed, that we are doing everything to make sure that greater Minnesota communities can come back and thrive. And so the first piece of that, as I mentioned, is the bonding bill, hopefully to be dealt with in a special session here coming up, that invests in infrastructure, that invests in economic development, that invests in projects around the state that communities have been asking for. Childcare. Childcare is obviously a heightened concern in this environment. Our childcare providers are, for the most part, small businesses, and they have been deeply impacted by this crisis throughout the state. And so that is something that we are engaging in the discussion on in terms of how do we get resources out to childcare providers to make sure that they can continue their operations. As much of a crisis as we had before COVID, the crisis is, as I said, only heightened. And then support for small businesses. There have been resources that have gone out through deed that were allocated by the legislature, and we've been involved in making sure that a fair share of those go out to greater Minnesota communities. We've been working with DEED, and we've been reasonably encouraged that so far the small business support that they have been putting out there has gone roughly 50-50 rural metro. And so we'll be continuing to monitor that particular situation going forward, and making sure that greater Minnesota's voice is in those discussions. And so with that, we'll move to questions, and I would encourage you to use the chat function to ask some questions, and I know we already have a couple, and so we're going to switch over here as I start my video, and we'll take the next 10 minutes or so and ask some questions. And this is where I'm going to sort of go through and just kind of see what we've got. And like I said, do use the chat if you have questions. Some questions about, on the front end, about the CARES Act funding and the limitations of those. How will it be calculated? We talked a little bit about that. Let's see here. A question about the Hennepin and Ramsey counties not double dipping into the CARES Act fund. And so as we discussed, Hennepin and Ramsey County got $317 million that was directly allocated to them by the federal government. They've also gotten other supports from both the state and the federal government in terms of specific medical and public health things. So for instance, the legislature passed $200 million that was made available to local governments, or made available to hospitals. And so Hennepin County Medical Center, which is a key hospital here in the metro area, has gotten some specific money. There has been, in terms of the other sort of $667 million that are allocated for local governments, there has been discussion that those are definitely to be reserved for the other 85 counties and the 853 cities around the state, and that Hennepin and Ramsey should not. And they have affirmatively said that they do not want access to those funds, that they realize that those are for other local units of government. So next question here. Question, does the eligible payroll expenses have to be outside of the original budget? PD or admin costs that are part of the original budget but time was rededicated to COVID is eligible or ineligible? I think our understanding is, to the extent that that time was put into COVID response, that they would be eligible. And I think that perspective is bolstered by the paragraph out of the FAQ document that I read that does presume that those salaries, because they are public safety, public health, it is presumed that their time is substantially dedicated to the COVID response. Question, is the time spent on policy development, answering employee questions, researching safe workplace return to work options eligible as a COVID response? That might be a little bit more of a question. And again, I think there will be some questions related to that going forward. I think that it could be, I would say, certainly to the extent that you have incurred overtime as you've done those functions. I think the overtime certainly would be something that would be eligible. And I would note, and I know a lot of cities are already doing this, I would definitely encourage you to very much keep track of all of the expenses that you are incurring that you think might be COVID related, and track those. And I know a lot of cities are already doing that, and I can't stress enough that they're, not only are there the CARES Act money, but there are FEMA expenses and things like that. Document all of it as you're going forward. Let's see here, other questions. Let's see here. On the CARES Act money, how does this tie in with FEMA money? It seems like there is some duplication between CARES Act and FEMA eligible expenses. I think that is certainly true, that there is some duplication. My understanding though on the CARES Act money is, usually there is a local match. And one thing that the FAQ does address is using CARES Act money as a match to other federal resources, and that would be allowed. I think the thing is you just have to be careful that you're not asking for money out of two pots for the same thing. But if you're matching, using CARES Act money to match FEMA expenses and the like, my understanding based on the guidance as I read it is that would be allowed. In your opinion, could funds from the CARES Act be used to improve teleworking capabilities even after the initial stay-at-home order has passed? So a couple of things. The dollars do have to be expended between March 1st and December 30th. And so the extent to which you've spent money to enhance the stay-at-home telework capabilities of employees during the period, that equipment is now purchased. Those capabilities are now stood up. And the FAQ does address to some extent that situation where you have maybe invested in equipment or invested in resources to do these things that, do you have to, sell that equipment and turn back the money to the federal government? No, you can keep those assets as I read the guidance, and the extent to which, you've invested in consulting to do those things and those expenses were incurred in that time period before December 30th, that all certainly goes to support the response to COVID, but also will end up being a benefit later on. I think what you have to be careful of is making commitments that take you outside of that December 30th timeframe. To the extent that you are making perhaps long-term contracts and the like, that would be something that could potentially run you afoul. And I think probably, in some cases of like software licenses or that sort of thing, may need some clarification. But generally, the equipment that you bought that benefits teleworking now is certainly something that the city can continue to use going forward. Question, how confident are you that there will be a special session June 12th and that bills will be passed in light of the riots? I think that is an excellent question. And I think that obviously the events of the last week have definitely changed and upended what was already going to be a pretty difficult legislative discussion starting June 12th. Pre-riots and pre-civil unrest, it was going to be a tough discussion because the Senate is very concerned about the governor's use of his emergency powers, the governor's use of the funding streams that have been provided to him already, and then how the CARES Act money might be used. And so they have a lot of questions, and there's a lot of tension around those issues. Now layer on top of it the civil unrest and the calls that we're hearing from members of the legislature related to the need for police reform, related to the need to allocate resources to rebuild, especially in Minneapolis and St. Paul. That adds another layer of complexity. And so it is a very complex situation. My hope, obviously, is that the legislature and the governor are able to roll up their sleeves, go into session, stay in for a couple of days, maybe a week, work through these things, have some sort of robust public process, and then come to agreement on these things. What my concern is that if we can't make progress in one area, that will stop progress in all areas. My concern is if we can't make progress on police reform and some of the things that need to be done that are arising out of the civil unrest and the killing of George Floyd, will that stop activity on everything else, such as a bonding bill? It certainly doesn't have to. But as we know, all of these issues become levers against each other. And so it will be, I think, a very complex task to address all of the challenges that the current situation, both COVID-19 and the social justice issues, it'll be very complicated to address all of those. And my hope, like I said, is that the legislature will be able to pretty quickly determine what is possible and then what needs to be set aside for further discussion. Finally, question, can funds be used for development of broadband capacities in a city to support work from home abilities or business developments. This I would refer you to the federal guidance to read a little bit more carefully, but I know that it has changed, and it looks like that the more recent guidance provides for a more narrow reading of what can be done around broadband. There's obviously some work that was done around broadband to support not only working from home, but all the distance learning that needed to take place. And so that is particularly COVID related. I think that is an activity that is allowed. The extent to which these funds can be used for sort of long-term development of capacity within a city, I think is very much in question. And I'd refer you to look more closely, and we'll look more closely at the federal guidance, because I know it is becoming more and more narrow. With that, it looks like we are out of questions. I very much appreciate you sticking with us for the hour. I hope that this has been informative. I hope that this has helped you understand a little bit more some of the dynamics around the state budget, the CARES Act money, and what could be the impact on local government aid. And I would encourage you to continue to follow CGMC social media, CGMC on Facebook, and our CGMC in Brief, which goes out to members every week as these situations develop. And as always, please don't hesitate to be in touch with us here at the office. We're happy to try to answer your questions. So thanks for being with us, and have a very good day and rest of the week.